Alrighty, welcome to the first lecture of week 4. This one's going to focus on cognitive dissonance. This is a phenomenon that occurs anytime we have a conflict going on in our mind. So this might be a conflict caused by new information that's revealed to us, and that new information is in conflict with how we think about ourselves or how we've been behaving, or for some reason it sort of highlights that there's a mix-up along the way, that we want it to be a certain way or behave a certain way, and this new information shows that we're not really in concert in terms of attitudes and behaviors. So there's a couple places where tension can come in. First is if there are two conflicting attitudes that we're holding. So we're both maybe conservative politically, but also in favor of some sort of social reform that the conservative side of the aisle isn't really in favor of. So it'd be holding conflicting attitudes. So it might be that we are a member of the Republican Party, but we also hold favorable views toward freedom of choice in the abortion debate. So those might be two potentially conflicting attitudes that we're holding. Or another version of it is if there's an attitude and behavior mix-up, where we think we're one way, but our behaviors are showing us another way. So if we think of ourselves as a responsible, caring person, and we perform behaviors that are other than being responsible and caring, that can cause a tension in our mind. And typically what this comes out as is feeling of guilt, that we're not living up to our own standards. We have fallen short. We're sometimes embarrassed or feel shame. And so there's this general discomfort when we experience. So anytime there's these sorts of conflicts, and again, the easiest way you can think of it is if you've done something wrong and you feel guilty about it, that's cognitive dissonance, because you haven't lived up to either your expectations or maybe your parents' expectations or society's expectations, and you feel guilt or shame about something you've done. That's sort of an easy way of understanding it. But it isn't always necessarily breaking the rules of your parents or breaking rules of society. It can be following along with the rules, but simply not matching up sort of the schemas or the structures or the thoughts that you have about your own self and how you want to behave, or holding two attitudes that are sort of in conflict with each other, that are incongruent. If they don't match up, that causes dissonance. And generally speaking, we want to avoid dissonance, or we make efforts to avoid dissonant feelings. And so the reading talked about a couple different places where dissonance happens. One is after we make a decision, and we might think of this as something like buyer's remorse, where we make a choice, but there are elements of that choice that aren't ideal or aren't perfect. So then we start regretting it, and we start maybe emphasizing those things that we don't like about our decision. So if I went out and bought a car today, after I get the car home, I might notice that the tires are a little worn, or there's more mileage than in retrospect than I wanted to have on it, or the resale isn't going to be what I like. Any number of things that might cause remorse after I buy the car, or choosing where to attend school, buying a house, relationship decisions. This is where we usually see sort of buyer's remorse types of things, where we have some immediate regret or aren't feeling great about our choice right after the fact. And the other is when actions don't match beliefs. So both of these are kind of behavioral in nature, behavior versus attitude in nature. When actions don't match our beliefs, it's basically what you did isn't who you want to be. So if you want to be a good student and do well in your courses and get a good job, and that's really one of your primary goals, but you blew off studying for an exam to go hang out with friends, that would be a place where dissonance might come in, because your actions don't match who you want to be, prioritizing studying. And dissonance can really come in for any number of reasons. And where it comes in the most, or where we're most likely to have dissonance, are those areas in life that we have prioritized. So in my previous example, if your priority is school or being a good student, and your student identity is sort of most salient, then that will cause dissonance if you disrupt that. Other types of identities could stick out for other people. So maybe socializing is an important part of your identity, and maybe more so than school, or maybe work is, or spouse, or kids, or family life, or significant other. Maybe the sports team you're a part of, or maybe the sports team that you cheer for, is a significant part of your sort of identity, and that's what's most salient. So whatever's most salient at the moment, or sort of in the context of the decision, that's really what's most likely to cause the most dissonance if you act against that identity. So again, the salience of any given identity changes based on context. So depending where you are or what you're doing, if you're at the workplace, your workplace professional identity is probably going to be more salient than your sports team identity, perhaps, or your school identity or student identity. So we can change from context to context and from decision to decision. So we have a lot of wiggle room, if you want to think of it that way, in terms of trying to avoid dissonance. If another identity is more salient than one that we have potentially dissonant feelings about, then we'll have less dissonance because another more important identity is kind of at the fore. So another way of thinking of that is that it's all variable, and we can basically play mental games with ourselves to avoid feeling bad about decisions. We alter the relative importance of the within the moment of the decision or of the behaviors, saying that, well, I really don't need to be hanging out with my friends every weekend. Or if your priority is student, I could probably go without studying a weekend or two. I've worked so hard on it. It's really important for me to hang out with my friends this weekend. So the first example of you don't need to be hanging out with your friends is if your normal identity is based around those friends, but you made a decision to study and not hang out with your friends. You're trying to make an excuse. Well, the friends aren't necessary every weekend. And then the second example is if your primary or your most salient identity is a student identity, but you made a choice to hang out with your friends, and then it's basically excuse making, saying, well, my friends are important. I don't need to study every weekend. I could take some time off. So again, it's all about this wiggle room and mental games that we can play to not feel guilty about our decisions. Some other factors that play a part in here in terms of attitudes matching up with behaviors. And this is if you're performing behaviors that don't match up with who you want to be, sort of that behavior versus attitude incongruence where they don't match up. There's implications if you're forced to do something that doesn't match up with your beliefs. You might have anger or resentment about that forced compliance, but you don't feel guilty about it because an outside force is putting pressure on you to do something. So it's, if you want to think of it, it's sort of their fault that you're having to do this. It's not your choice to perform the behavior. So in that type of situation, there's less cognitive dissonance. There might be dissonance about not fighting back or speaking up, but it's likely to be much less than sort of voluntary behaviors that don't match up with your attitudes. Also, there's implications for incentives. So if you receive some sort of pay or other social benefits or anything that you can think of might be an incentive for performing a behavior that you normally wouldn't, that placement of the incentive, again, it's all about mental games that we can play with ourselves in our mind to feel less guilty. So we would say, well, I normally wouldn't do that. That's not the kind of person I am, but the money was just so good that I had to take it. Or whatever the other benefit was just so good that I had to take it for this one time, just as a way to sort of excuse our behaviors. Another factor in cognitive dissonance and the sort of the frequency that it would pop up is in terms of just sort of personality characteristics. The reading talked about maximizers versus satisfiers. Maximizers are always trying to look for the best possible deal, and they are therefore more likely to feel cognitive dissonance afterwards if they felt like, well, I could have done this a little bit better, or this could have been a better arrangement, or I could have made just a little bit more money. Take those versus satisfiers, who are more interested in getting a sort of good enough result and moving on with their lives. Would probably all be better off if we were a little more in the satisfier camp of just sort of, let's just keep it moving forward, not sort of stress about every detail of getting the best possible deal. But so some personality characteristics play an important role in cognitive dissonance and maybe the reduction of cognitive dissonance if you tend to be more of a satisfier. So how does this all really shape up in terms of predicting behaviors? Attitudes in general can predict some behaviors, but it isn't always such a clean relationship of, well, this is what the person believes, therefore this is how they're going to behave, or this is their social identity, they're Pittsburgh Steeler fans, so this is definitely how they're going to behave at the game. Part of the benefit of having a social identity and somewhat predictable behaviors, so if we know this person is employed at the university and they have a stable family life and they have sort of a strong, steady, consistent identity, they're perhaps a little bit more predictable. And there's a theory called uncertainty reduction, basically that in everything we're striving to reduce the amount of uncertainty in our life. So being able to kind of pigeonhole people is part of that uncertainty reduction sort of process, where we're trying to figure them out without having to do a ton of work on it, like interviewing them to figure them out, but be able to sort of understand their motives and what they're going to try to accomplish in any situation. Part of that benefit of having the social identity or social identities is that we reduce that uncertainty and we know a little bit more about a situation and kind of what to expect. Like, okay, these people are whatever Steelers fans. They sit over there. They're going to be cheering for this. They're doing this. These people over here are security guards. This is what their behaviors are likely going to be. These people are participants. These people are refs. These people work concession stand. Everybody has their role in that sort of social setting, and all of that is to reduce uncertainty. But nothing is perfectly predictable. There are a lot of other factors that dictate more than our sort of overarching value system or our kind of pigeonholed social identities. So in some cases we act without thinking, and then we get sort of the cognitive dissonance of, wait, what did I just do? I didn't fulfill my role. My behaviors didn't match up with my identity. Some of it is dictated by the strength that you have with an identity. So, yes, I'm a Hoosier, but I've only lived in the state for a handful of months, so I'm not sort of a born and raised Hoosier. So I kind of fit in with the social identity as a Hoosier, but I'm not sort of deeply vested in it. So that might impact the salience. So and that's the next one is identity salience. Like, sure, I'm a CPA, but right now I'm a Bengals fan. Or sure, I'm a regular sort of good citizen in society, but right now I'm a Bengals fan. So if you're sitting at the game and you're cheering for the Bengals, that might have more salience for you at the moment than any other sort of identity placements of spouse, father, a good worker, good citizen, whatever's more salient at the moment might take ownership of the behaviors more so than a kind of a larger overarching value system. Also, past experiences play a part in it. So sure, I'm a good member of this social group, but last time I did that, I ended up in jail, or last time I did that, it didn't go well for me. So even though the group is moving in this behavior, I'm not going to, because my past experiences have shown that isn't really a great move for me. And then there's always sort of situational elements, and this is where we talked about the role of incentives, the role of forced compliance. And sure, I'm social group member, but if I do this that goes against the group, I get a lot of money or power or prestige or any other factor, whatever's important to the person. So there might be situational elements that will let us sort of mentally wiggle off the hook if we're acting in a way that's against our social identity. And so the last slide of this lecture is your discussion item. So the first discussion item of the week, go ahead and open up your discussion post. This is item 1 of 4. Discuss a time where you felt cognitive dissonance as a fan or as an athlete if you participated in sports. What was happening that made you feel the dissonance, where your behaviors didn't match up with how you thought about yourself or the standards that you were trying to uphold? Was the dissonance due to you not doing something that other fans or other athletes are doing, or was it for something that you actually did that didn't match up with your values? If you can't think of anything related to sports, just pick a time in your life where you felt cognitive dissonance. Basically, everybody at some point has done something that's made them feel guilty. So talk about that if you can't figure out something that ties directly into being a fan or an athlete. And And then the second item of it, how did you ultimately overcome the cognitive dissonance? Did you perform an action to sort of make it right? Did you simply forget about it over time? Did you rationalize your behavior or do those sort of mental gaming that I was talking about in the earlier slides? What ultimately got you sort of through feeling guilty or feeling cognitive dissonance about the behaviors that you did as a fan or as an athlete that didn't really match up with your value system? So take a couple minutes, hop over to your discussion post and write up this first item. And that's it for this lecture. So hop right into your second lecture.